we have quite a few questions that we still have dealing with things like the overtime rule, which has been incredibly significant, the fiduciary rule, a lot of the challenges that we're currently facing. So I'd like to be able to submit those to the record for you. But I would tell you just quickly on the overtime rule, this has a tremendous effect for nonprofits and for universities. And every nonprofit and university and small business that I talk to is struggling under this tremendously, especially nonprofits. Where the nonprofits, often the people work there, understand they're not there to get rich, and they understand the nonprofit doesn't have very much money. But you put the nonprofits in a very difficult situation. The nonprofits advertise to their donors that we are very efficient in the use of dollars because we have very low overhead, because the people that work there work for very little money and love to do it. Now you're literally making it tougher for them to fundraise because they're going to show a higher amount of overhead cost, which some donors don't want to give to something with a higher overhead cost. They want to make sure it gets directly to the place it needs to go. So it makes it tougher for them in fundraising and makes it tougher for the entities. Secretary Perez and I had this conversation last year. I brought him letters that the YWCA sent to my office saying we have X amount of dollars. When the overtime rule is implemented, if it is, we will close domestic violence shelters because we don't have enough money to run all of them and meet the standard. We will meet the standard, but it will force the closure of domestic violence shelters. I hear the same thing from church employees, that rarely a church employee makes that amount in Central Time Zone, and that they're struggling on what do? I love to give my time. I'm involved in this work because of my love for it. And even dealing with how it's implemented. As you go through the rule, which I'm sure you've taken a good hard look and gone through the overtime rule, it's incredibly difficult just to be able to determine, and with 25 weeks for small businesses to be able to implement it, when you walk through all the exceptions, which I took some time to be able to walk through all the exceptions that are within it, things as simple as commissioned sales employees, farm workers, motion picture theater employees, which I thought was interesting, motor carrier drivers, amusement park employees, all these broad exemptions, the allowance to be able to do, are you 51% supervisor or are you 49% supervisor? One of my favorites as I look through it, a generally not exempt are registered nurses, but generally exempt are licensed practical nurses, but no, they're not exempt, but nurses are exempt, registered nurses, and it's everybody's trying to figure this out in a 25-week time period of who's in, who's out. Is there any chance that small business, that nonprofits, that universities and others can get more time on this, or to be able to have some consideration within that lane? And this is a very big issue for a tremendous number of companies, as is the fiduciary rule, as is things like the rules dealing with franchises. There are so many issues that are coming at so many small businesses right now. They're having a very difficult time maintaining this.
So that's a very large question.
Yes, ma'am.
In a
I know
very
you're running
short
out of
period of
too.
time. But one thing I would like to talk about for the not-for-profits, one of the things that the Labor Department has been doing in recognition of that is that we have been, since the final rule has come out, and even before then, we have been working directly with funders of not-for-profits. We've sat down, we've had many meetings with foundations and other funders to talk to them about why they should increase their funding for not-for-profits.
Wow.
So that there would be an opportunity, and why, even though their administrative costs are going up, it's not because they're being frivolous in any way. We've gotten some good responses from foundations.
How many non-for-profits are there out there in America?
Senator, I could not tell you. I mean, I think if I read the rule, I might know. I mean, if I read in the
How many have you met with at this point? Because there are hundreds of thousands.
We have. Do you mean how many not-for-profits
Yes.
we've met with?
No. Yeah, how many have you met with? Because there are hundreds of thousands of them.
We before the rule came out, we had a number of listening sessions specifically with not-for-profits. Then, since the rule has come out, not only did we put out guidance for not-for-profits, specific guidance, but we also had a number of webinars specifically for not-for-profits to talk to them about how they could implement the rule. I mean, there's not just one way to implement the overtime rule, and we've been giving a lot of technical assistance, both specifically to universities, as you mentioned, in higher education, for not-for-profits and for small businesses.
So basically, you're giving donors to non-for-profits 25 weeks to donate more, so that they can stay open. Because I'm telling you, some of these domestic violence shelters are closing because they don't have the money to be able to run them. I mean, this is a big issue to a lot of nonprofits in this very short window. They don't just magically have more money in October, December.
If I can add to this, because I think the nonprofits that are struggling the most with this are nonprofits who may have 24-hour call centers. They may, in fact, you could sit there and say, well, there's an easy way to comply with this rule. Make sure no one works over 40 hours a week, right?
Or donate more money.
Right. Well, yeah, I get that. But my point is that very many of these nonprofits that are hit the hardest are nonprofits that rely on call centers, rely on the ability to call workers in, at 2 o'clock in the morning to deal with a domestic violence situation, deal with placement of a child. And I think you need to understand that where the answer, the simple answer sometimes in the overtime rule is that you can in fact comply by maintaining, and I'm sympathetic to your rule. I mean, I think that when you work someone, what is it, $23,000 a year right now, somebody can be classified as a manager, and then you can work them 60 hours.
Or 80 hours.
Or 80 hours. And, to me, the problem is that you're not only not paying them enough for the 40 hours, you're also taking away the advantage that they may have of getting a second job to support their family. So I may see this a little differently than Senator Lankford, but I will say I think that the overtime as it relates to on-call is very problematic.
So thank you, Senator. I don't think I'm going to have really time to answer all these questions, but I would be happy if you wanted to submit some QFRs
we will.
For the record.
We will definitely do that.
We would be happy to answer those.
Is it possible for us to be able to get responses back, and we'll be very specific, within 30 days? Is that a reasonable time period?
We will do our level best.
We will do our level best.
So give me a percentage of what level best looks like. 80% chance I get those?
I guess it depends upon the number of questions.
Okay. So we will be very specific in our questions as we walk through it. I would tell you December 1st is screaming at a lot of people in my state.
I understand that you may or may not know, Senator, that there were 2 lawsuits filed in the last 2 days in an attempt to unjoin the overtime rules. So it's very possible that no matter what the Department of Labor would prefer to happen and to the date, that it may be pushed back.
Well, there are a tremendous number of people that are begging for that because it is incredibly difficult to both understand, implement in a lot of businesses because of the number of exceptions. And if you're a nonprofit especially, or a university, I've spoken with university presidents again, they tell me tuition is going up in the spring specifically because of this rule.
Just one last comment, Senator, which is that the exemptions that you were talking about, those are statutory exemptions to overtime. They're not affected one way or another by our overtime rule, which only deals with the white-collar exemptions. So I understand that those exemptions are confusing. That's because the Fair Labor Standards Act has been amended from time to time, and Congress puts in an exemption for this one and an exemption for that one. But those are long-standing exemptions. They're not new to this overtime rule.
But every small business employer is right now hiring a consultant to be able to come help explain this to them because they know what they have and they don't know what's coming. And so they have added expense already of that consultant and then trying to figure out what to do on the cost on it, or who they're going to lay off, or who they're going to keep, or who they're going to switch to hourly, as multiple businesses I've talked to have already shifted salary to hourly and try to make the shift. I know you've got to